In ancient Greece, more than 2,000 years ago, there was a rather bizarre medical theory. Hiccups were signals that the soul was trying to escape the body. You heard that right. Some philosophers at the time believed that the human soul was a breath of air, living peacefully inside the body. But sometimes it would suddenly stir and try to break free, and the sound of that commotion was a hiccup. Sounds absurd, doesn't it? But here's the thing, this theory wasn't the rambling of a madman. It was proposed by some of the brightest minds of ancient Greece, Pythagoras, Plato, and even Hippocrates. They argued about this idea for decades, leaving behind some truly fascinating historical fragments. Tonight, we're not here to give a lecture. We're just here to tell a story about hiccups, the soul, and the body. It's a little strange, a little fun, and maybe the next time you hiccup, you'll remember that 2,000-year-old argument about freedom. So where did this strange idea actually come from? To answer that, we need to go back further than Plato, all the way back to a man named Pythagoras. You probably know Pythagoras for his famous theorem about triangles. Every student has memorized it at some point. But what most people don't know is that Pythagoras and his followers had a very different side to them. They were not just mathematicians. They were also mystics. They believed that numbers were the secret language of the universe. And they also believed that the soul lived inside the body like a prisoner inside a cell. Here is the key idea. In ancient Greek, there were two words that often got tangled up together. One was psyche, which meant soul or mind. The other was pneuma, which meant breath or air. To the Pythagoreans, these two things were almost the same. The soul was a kind of breath. When you were alive, you were breathing. When you stopped breathing, your life was over. So the soul and the breath were bound together in a very literal way. Now imagine looking at a hiccup through that lens. A hiccup is sudden. It is involuntary. It comes out of nowhere. You cannot control it, and it sounds like a sharp little gasp. To a Pythagorean philosopher, that was not just a random spasm. That was a sign. The soul, that breath inside you, was trying to get out. It would bump against the walls of the body, looking for an exit. And every time it bumped, you hiccuped. This idea did not stay with the Pythagoreans for long. It spread. It traveled across the Greek world, from one city to another, from one thinker to another. And eventually, it reached the ears of the most famous philosopher in history, Plato. Plato took this idea and ran with it. In one of his most famous dialogues, a book called the Phaedo, he wrote about the relationship between the soul and the body. And he did not paint a pretty picture. Plato described the body as a prison. The soul, he said, was trapped inside it. It longed to be free. It longed to return to the pure world of ideas where it came from. And every now and then, the soul would try to escape. It would push against the walls of its prison. A hiccup, according to this view, was the sound of that push. It was the soul rattling the bars of its cage. That is a powerful image, and it is easy to see why it caught on. It is poetic. It is dramatic. It gives meaning to something that otherwise seems meaningless. But not everyone was convinced by poetry. At the same time that Plato was writing about the imprisoned soul, another man was watching Hiccups from a very different angle. His name was Hippocrates. You have probably heard of him too. He is called the father of modern medicine, and he was not interested in poetry. He was interested in observation. Hippocrates wrote a series of medical texts that are still studied today. And in one of those texts, he mentioned hiccups. His explanation was much more down to earth. He said that hiccups were caused by excess gas in the stomach. The gas built up, it needed to escape, and the body pushed it out through the throat. That pushing motion created the sound. Nothing mystical about it, just air moving through the body. But here is where it gets interesting. Hippocrates was too careful a thinker to completely dismiss the spiritual explanation. He noted that during severe bouts of hiccups, patients often described a strange feeling, a kind of inner agitation, a sense that something inside them was unsettled. He did not say that this was the soul trying to escape, but he did not say it was impossible either. He left the door open, just a crack. And here is a funny detail. The remedies Hippocrates recommended for stopping hiccups are almost exactly the same as the ones your grandmother might suggest today. Suddenly startle the person, hold your breath, drink a little cold water. These tricks have been passed down for more than 2,000 years. They sometimes work. They often do not. But the fact that we still use them tells you something. The puzzle of hiccups has not been solved. We are still using the same desperate guesses. So by the middle of the 4th century before the Common Era, there were two competing explanations for hiccups. One said the soul was trying to escape. The other said it was just gas. Two ideas, both supported by very smart people. And the debate was not over yet. In fact, there was a question that nobody had really asked. If the soul really wanted to get out, why did it stop after a single hiccup? Why not just leave all at once? That question would soon be asked by a younger philosopher with a sharper mind. His name was Aristotle. He had studied under Plato for nearly 20 years at the academy in Athens. But Aristotle was not the kind of student who simply repeated what his teacher said. He questioned everything. He wanted proof. He wanted logic. He wanted to take things apart and see how they worked. And when he turned his attention to hiccups, he did exactly that. Aristotle wrote a collection of short scientific essays called the Problemata. In it, he examined all kinds of everyday puzzles that most people never stop to think about. Why do we yawn? Why do we sneeze? Why does the sea taste salty? And yes, why do we hiccup? His approach was simple but powerful. Observe, describe, and explain using natural causes, not supernatural ones. His explanation for hiccups was straightforward. It works like this. The diaphragm, a large muscle sitting below the lungs, suddenly contracts. That contraction is involuntary, meaning you cannot control it. When it happens, it forces air up through the throat in a quick burst. As the air passes through the narrow space of the vocal cords, it makes a sound. That sound is the hiccup. No soul needed, no prison escape, just a muscle and some air moving through a tube. But Aristotle was not satisfied with just giving a mechanical explanation. He wanted to argue against the soul theory directly, and he had a devastating question. If the soul truly wanted to escape the body, why would it stop after a single hiccup? Think about it. If you were trapped in a room and wanted to get out, would you push against the door once and then give up? No, you would keep pushing. You would try harder. You would find another way. But hiccups do not work like that. They come and go. They stop and start. Sometimes you hiccup 3 times, sometimes 10, sometimes 30. But eventually they stop, and the soul stays right where it was. This made no sense to Aristotle. A soul that truly wanted to escape would not make a few weak attempts and then surrender. It would either succeed or keep trying forever. He also noticed something else. The sound of a hiccup is very specific. It is short. It is sharp. It is repetitive. And it always sounds the same. If the soul were making a desperate attempt to break free, would it always make the same tiny noise? Would it not vary its efforts? Would it not groan or cry out or make some other sound? But hiccups are monotonous. They are mechanical. They sound exactly like what they are, a muscle twitch. Aristotle even had a sense of humor about the whole thing. In one passage, he described the sound of a hiccup as being like a small, frightened animal trying to escape from a throat. It is a funny image. You can picture a tiny creature scrambling up and getting stuck, making a squeak each time it tries. Aristotle was gently mocking the soul theory. He was saying, look, if you want to imagine something escaping, imagine a mouse, not a soul. It is more accurate. And here is another thing. Aristotle knew that emotions and sensations could affect the body in strange ways. Fear can make your heart race. Sadness can make you cry. Joy can make you laugh. These are connections between the mind and the body that science could not fully explain. So Aristotle left open the possibility that some hiccups might be triggered by emotional states. Perhaps a sudden shock or a wave of anxiety could cause the diaphragm to contract. In that sense, he allowed that the soul or the mind could play a role, but not as an escape artist, only as a trigger. Now think about this for a moment. Right now, as you lie here, your diaphragm is rising and falling without you even thinking about it. That is a quiet miracle. Every breath you take is a cooperation between your will and your body's automatic systems. But every now and then, that cooperation breaks down for a second. A hiccup is that breakdown. And Aristotle was the first person to look at it and say, this is not a message from another world. It is just your body doing something weird. His analysis of hiccups was not the final word. Other philosophers and doctors would build on his work, challenge it, and add their own ideas. But Aristotle had shifted the conversation. He had taken hiccups out of the realm of poetry and placed them firmly in the realm of biology. And yet, the debate was far from over. Because even if the soul was not trying to escape, there was still something deeply strange about a sound you cannot control. Other schools of thought had their own takes, and those takes came from many directions. The Stoics were among the most interesting contributors. They were philosophers who believed that wisdom came from accepting what you cannot control. Their central teaching was simple. Some things are up to you, and some things are not. Your thoughts, your choices, your values, those are up to you. Your body, your health, your hiccups, those are not. So when the Stoics looked at a hiccup, they did not see a soul trying to escape. They saw a perfect reminder of human limitation. Your body can do things without your permission. It can spasm and twitch and make strange sounds, and you cannot stop it by willpower alone. That is humbling. And for the Stoics, that humility was the beginning of wisdom. They would say, use the hiccup as a small lesson. Let it remind you that you are not the master of everything. Breathe through it. Let it pass. And move on. Now, if you have ever tried to stop a hiccup by concentrating really hard, you know exactly what the Stoics meant. The more you focus on it, the more stubborn it becomes. It is as if your body is playing a joke on you. And the Stoics would say, good, let the joke be your teacher. Then there were the Cynics. They were a rowdier group. Their most famous figure was Diogenes, a man who lived in a barrel and made a sport of embarrassing powerful people. He had no patience for fancy theories or long speeches, and he had a legendary encounter with Hiccups. The story goes like this. Diogenes was engaged in a heated debate with a philosopher who would not stop talking. The man was lecturing endlessly about the nature of the soul, using big words and complex arguments. Diogenes listened for a while. Then, at the most dramatic moment, he deliberately let out a loud, long hiccup. The room fell silent. Diogenes looked at the speaker and said, "Your theories are just like this hiccup. They make a lot of noise, but in the end, they are just hot air. The story may be apocryphal, but it captures something true." The Cynics believed that philosophy should be practical, not abstract. If you cannot explain a hiccup without a long speech, your explanation is probably worthless. Meanwhile, the Epicureans took a different approach entirely. They believed that everything in the universe, including the human body, was made of tiny atoms moving and colliding in empty space. There was no soul in the spiritual sense, only atoms arranged in a particular way. So a hiccup, to an Epicurean, was simply a random collision of atoms in the chest area. It had no meaning. It had no purpose. It was just matter in motion. This view was calm and detached. It removed all mystery from the hiccup. But for many people, that was too cold. They wanted the mystery. As time passed, the medical understanding of hiccups also advanced. The most important figure in this later period was Galen, a Greek doctor who worked in the Roman Empire about 500 years after Hippocrates. Galen was a brilliant anatomist. He dissected animals and studied their nerves. He discovered that different nerves controlled different functions, and he was the first person to suggest that hiccups might be caused by a problem with the nerves connected to the diaphragm. He did not have the word reflex, but he described the concept. He said that an irritation somewhere in the body could send a signal to the diaphragm, and that signal would cause the spasm. This was a massive step forward. It moved the explanation from gas to nerves, from the stomach to the spinal cord. But Galen also kept one foot in the older tradition. He believed that the nerves carried not just physical signals, but also something like the soul's influence. He tried to have it both ways, and in doing so, he reflected a tension that ran through all of ancient medicine, the desire to explain everything physically, and the suspicion that something more was at work. Meanwhile, ordinary people in ancient Greece and Rome had their own folk beliefs about hiccups. They did not read Plato or Galen. They just knew what their grandmothers told them. One common belief was that a hiccup meant someone was talking about you. If you hiccuped unexpectedly, it meant a friend or an enemy was mentioning your name somewhere far away. Another belief was that hiccups were a sign that you had eaten or drunk too much. That one, at least, had some truth to it. These folk beliefs carried on for centuries, long after the philosophers and doctors had moved on to more refined theories. So by the end of the ancient world, there was no single answer to the question of hiccups. There were at least 5 major explanations floating around: the soul escape theory from the Pythagoreans and Plato, the biological analysis from Aristotle, the acceptance lesson from the Stoics, the mocking dismissal from the Cynics, and the nerve theory from Galen. All of them coexisted. All of them had followers, and none of them was fully proven or fully disproven. The ancient world faded. The Roman Empire fell. The libraries burned. Many of these ideas were lost or buried, but the hiccup did not go away. It waited. And when science woke up again, centuries later, it found the same puzzle waiting for it. The centuries passed. The great libraries of Alexandria and Athens were burned or abandoned. Many of the old texts were lost, buried under the rubble of history. But the hiccup survived. It did not change. It did not evolve. It remained exactly the same small, mysterious sound that had puzzled the Greeks. And when modern science finally turned its attention to the human body, it found that same old puzzle waiting. Today, we know much more than the Greeks did. We have microscopes. We have X-rays. We have brain scanners. We can watch the human body in action, second by second, cell by cell. And yet, when it comes to hiccups, our best explanation still sounds surprisingly incomplete. Here is what modern science has established. A hiccup is a sudden, involuntary contraction of the diaphragm, the large dome-shaped muscle that sits beneath your lungs and helps you breathe. When the diaphragm contracts unexpectedly, it pulls air into your throat in a quick burst. That burst of air hits your vocal cords, which snap shut almost instantly. The sound you hear, that familiar hic, is the sound of the vocal cords closing. It is a reflex, an automatic response that your body performs without asking for permission. The reflex is controlled by a loop of nerves. It begins somewhere in your brainstem, the ancient part of your brain that handles basic functions like breathing and heart rate. A signal travels down the phrenic nerve, which runs from your neck to your diaphragm. The diaphragm spasms. Another signal goes back up to the brain. The loop completes, and you hiccup. The whole process takes less than a second. This much we have figured out. But the deeper question remains: why does this reflex exist at all? What is its purpose? Here, science becomes less certain. There are several theories, but none has been proven beyond doubt. Most widely accepted theory is that hiccups are a leftover from our time in the womb. Fetuses start hiccuping around the 6th week of pregnancy. They do it a lot. Some researchers believe that fetal hiccups help train the diaphragm and the breathing muscles, preparing the baby for life outside the womb. After birth, the reflex is no longer needed, but it does not completely disappear. It lingers, like an old software program running in the background, occasionally triggered by random inputs. Another theory suggests that hiccups might be related to feeding in mammals. Some scientists have noticed that the pattern of a hiccup, a sudden inhalation followed by a quick closure of the throat, is similar to the sucking reflex in infants. Perhaps hiccups help babies coordinate breathing and swallowing. Once again, the theory makes sense, but it remains unproven. And then there are the triggers. Almost anything can set off a hiccup. Eating too fast, drinking carbonated beverages, sudden changes in temperature, excitement, stress, laughter, even a spicy meal. The list is long and varied. What is strange is that these triggers have nothing obvious in common. They affect different parts of the body in different ways, yet they all converge on the same reflex. Why? Nobody knows. Perhaps the most frustrating thing about hiccups is that they usually stop on their own after a few minutes. Most people do not even need a remedy. They just wait. But for a small number of people, hiccups can become chronic and last for days, weeks, or even years. The medical record for the longest bout of hiccups belongs to an American man named Charles Osborne. He started hiccuping in 1922 while trying to weigh a hog on a farm in Iowa. He did not stop for 68 years. He hiccuped an estimated 430 million times. He learned to live with it. He ate. He slept. He worked. He even got married. But the hiccups never left him. They only stopped when he died in 1990 at the age of 97. This case is a medical miracle, but also a profound mystery. If hiccups were just a simple reflex, how could they persist for decades without any obvious damage to his health? And the treatments, they have barely changed since Hippocrates. People still recommend holding your breath, drinking water upside down, being suddenly startled, or eating a spoonful of sugar. There is no scientific consensus on why these methods sometimes work. Some researchers suspect that they distract the brain or interrupt the nerve loop. Others think the effect is mostly psychological. The truth is, we do not know. Here is the irony. We can send rockets to Mars. We can edit genes. We can map the entire human genome. But we cannot fully explain a hiccup. The ancient Greeks were wrong about the soul trying to escape, but they were right about one thing. This tiny, ridiculous sound touches something deep and unresolved in our understanding of the body. It reminds us that our own bodies still hold secrets we have not unlocked. And that brings us back to where we started. The hiccup is not a message from the soul. but it is a message from somewhere, and we are still trying to decode it. After all these centuries, after all the theories and experiments and debates, the hiccup remains a quiet reminder of how much we do not know about our own bodies. But perhaps that is exactly why it has fascinated us for so long. It is small. It is harmless. It is almost ridiculous. And yet it refuses to be fully explained. Think about what a hiccup really is. It is a brief moment when your body acts without your permission. You cannot command it to stop. You cannot reason with it. You cannot ignore it. It simply happens, and then it stops, and you go back to normal. But in that tiny gap between control and chaos, something interesting happens. You become aware of the fact that you are not the sole owner of your body. The body has its own life, its own rhythms, its own stubborn habits. A hiccup is a little rebellion of the flesh. And maybe, just maybe, the ancient Greeks were onto something when they called it a sign of the soul stirring. Not because a soul is literally trying to leave, but because the hiccup reveals a crack in our sense of self. For a split second, you are not the master of your domain. Something else is moving inside you. Different cultures have different ways of naming this strange event. In French, the word for hiccup is hake, which comes from an old word meaning a small door latch. The image is beautiful. A little door in the throat that opens and closes by itself. In German, the word is schluckauf, which means swallow up, as if something is rising and being swallowed at the same time. In Japanese, the word is shakuri, an onomatopoeia that captures the sound. In Chinese, the word for hiccup is deji, which simply means to make the G sound. Each language tries to grab the experience with its own set of sounds and images. Each one is a little poem, and each one tells you something about how that culture sees the hiccup as a glitch, a visitor, a tiny drama. What all these views share is a sense of wonder. Nobody has ever managed to make the hiccup boring. Even the driest medical textbooks use words like mysterious and poorly understood. A hiccup is one of those rare phenomena that remains stubbornly human, stubbornly ordinary, and yet stubbornly unexplained. It is the perfect subject for a bedtime story because it asks a big question in the smallest possible package. As you lie here, warm and comfortable, your breathing is slow and regular. Your diaphragm rises and falls without effort. Your body is doing its job quietly behind the scenes. But somewhere in the deep wiring of your nervous system, a tiny loop is waiting. It may never fire tonight, or it may fire once, twice, 3 times for no reason at all. And if it does, you will know. You will feel that small tug, that tiny rebellion, and you will remember this story. So here we are, at the end of a journey that began with a strange idea in ancient Greece. We have traveled through the thoughts of Pythagoras, Plato, Hippocrates, Aristotle, the Stoics, the Cynics, the Epicureans, Galen, and the modern scientists. We have seen how each generation tried to make sense of the same small sound, and we have seen that nobody has fully succeeded. That is not a failure. It is a gift. Some questions are more valuable than their answers. The hiccup is one of them. Perhaps the next time you hiccup, You will not just reach for a glass of water. You will pause for a second. You will feel that small spasm and think, the ancients thought my soul was trying to get out. The doctors say it is just a nerve. And both of them are right in their own way. The hiccup belongs to both worlds, the world of flesh and the world of wonder. It is a tiny bridge between what we know and what we cannot know. And now, as the night grows deeper, let that thought settle. Let your breath become soft and even. Let your diaphragm rest. Your soul, whatever it is exactly where it belongs tonight. There is no need for it to knock, no need for it to try the latch. Everything is fine just as it is. So close your eyes. Listen to the quiet. And if a tiny hiccup should come, let it be a friendly reminder. You are alive, you are mysterious, and you are part of a story that has been told for more than 2,000 years. Good night. Sleep well. And may your breathing be calm until morning.